Morning, everybody. Bear with me just a second. I am traveling today and only have one screen, so I'm gonna share my screen, and then I think I'll lose all the, Zoom chat and everything. So if there are questions, maybe just shout them out, or Shailea or Tracy, if you guys could let me know if we're getting
Sure.
questions. Okay. Can you guys see just the presentation now?
We can. Yep.
Super. Thank you. Okay, so we missed last week, but we're still going through permitting considerations, and we've got quite a bit to go through today. So I'm going to keep us moving. But as I said last week, if you are feeling brave this Friday morning and want to turn your camera on or ask questions, I would love for this to be interactive and useful for you all. Otherwise, I said last time that my management strategy is just screaming into the void, so I can continue to do that for an hour into the Zoom void this morning. That was a joke, by the way. Okay. Here we go. I can see my screen now. So I think we had left off right here. We had been just about ready to jump into manufactured homes. Does that sound right? And so generally, a new manufactured home, you can see here, has to be elevated to the same standards that a stick-built home does for typical construction. We talked 2 weeks ago about some anchoring examples to anchor that to the foundation. And this, as I said, applies if it's outside of a manufactured home park, in a new park, or where it has suffered substantial damage due to flooding. There is that national standard exemption for existing manufactured home parks that I think we talked about a couple weeks ago as well. Non-flood damaged homes can be just replaced. The big thing there is that they can, instead of going up to the BFE, they can be elevated just 3 feet above grade. And be aware, if you guys are studying for the CFM, those are national standards, but you may have higher standards in your community. Okay, and I think that we talked about Zone AO as well a couple weeks ago, but Zone AO is a flood depth. So when you go look at your firm, it's going to report a depth, and that is the biggest difference here. We're going to have a depth between 1 and 3 feet for Zone AO. And for residential structures, we have to elevate those. If there is a depth specified on the firm, we've got to elevate at least to that. If there is no depth specified, then we're going to sort of split the middle of that 1 to 3 feet and have to go up at least 2 feet. And you can see the diagram here that shows that highest adjacent grade with at least 2 feet of elevation to the lowest floor level. Yeah, and if, as I said, if there's Zone AO with no numbers, it does not have a depth specified on the firm. Non-residential structures, remember, we can flood-proof non-residential structures, but we don't flood-proof residential structures. Residential structures are only elevated. And so pretty much the same concept, except that in addition to elevating, you also have the option to flood-proof to that same level if there is a depth in your Zone AO that's specified, and at least 2 feet if it doesn't specify a depth. And if you are taking the CFM anytime soon, I remember a few questions on Zone AO, having to pick out the depth and answer questions accordingly. Okay, and here's just another diagram that we mentioned. So if say you've got natural grade down here, and you're in a, let's say you're in a zone AO with no depth specified on the firm, you have to bring in at least 2 feet of fill to elevate and get that lowest floor elevation at least 2 feet up above the depth on your zone AO map. Any questions on that before I move on?
I
Okay.
don't see in the chat. Nope.
Cumulative rise is a tricky one. So if the sum of all of the projects that the community is permitting in this area exceed, remember the national standard is 1 foot. Montana has a higher standard of only allowing half a foot of cumulative rise. That's the limit, and it's tough to keep track of cumulative rise with multiple different projects. And so the words that I guess no engineering consultant likes to hear is a conditional letter of map revision, a CLOMAR. If a project is going to increase the BFE, increase that cumulative rise more than 1 foot nationally, half a foot in Montana, they've got to go through that CLOMAR process before the community can issue a permit for them. And then once they've got the permit, within 6 months, they have to submit a LOMAR after the fact. The CLOMAR is, as the conditional part of that name suggests, does not actually change the floodplain maps. The CLOMAR is, excuse me, the LOMAR after the fact is what makes those changes to the maps. And remember, Montana has a higher standard, that half a foot. And here's a nice diagram that shows cumulative rise. So, you know, we've got before development, I suppose a more natural floodplain here. And then as more and more development comes in, this incremental increase ultimately can flood or increase that BFE to the point where a neighbor would be flooded. And that do no harm principle is one of the, I suppose, guiding beacons for floodplain management. So that's what we're trying to avoid. Talk really quickly about fill in the special flood hazard area. Fill, if it's placed in the floodplain, especially if it's improperly placed, can have some pretty significant negative consequences, can send floodwaters down a different path, a different drainage path, to a neighbor, increase our BFEs. You'll notice in your community regulations that they talk about, they'll have specifications for fill, you know, being properly placed, and I think suitable is the word that they use. And so that means that if we're going to do something like place a structure on fill, we need to place the fill in small lifts, have each of those lifts properly compacted, and have it free of debris and rocks and trees, and just generally able to withstand any flood forces. Grading and drainage is also a specific requirement in this section of the CFRs. And specifically, we're talking about those zones AH and AO with flood depths and sheet flow. But really any development within the special flood hazard area ought to consider grading. Mark Pittman, our Kalispell engineer, well, I guess he's retired Kalispell engineer that we begged to come back halftime. He has some good examples of subdivision design and layouts that he did, and how the importance of providing proper grading for drainage to keep the water away from structures. Another requirement in this section relates to RVs. Here we've got the definition, floodplain management definition here for a recreational vehicle, single chassis, 400 square feet or less, and basically, not intended to be a permanent residence that can be towed around. And so some of you, if you know Sean O'Callahan in Gallatin County, he had a pretty tricky example of this. You might ask him about it at the next floodplain conference, next time you see him. But RVs can be placed in the special flood hazard area and are in compliance. As this says, we've got these three separate options for them. If they're on site for fewer than 180 consecutive days, which the implication there being they're not a permanent structure, or if they are if they're basically ready to roll, ready to, in the event of flood, for the owner to hook them up and drive them away out of danger. The third option is for them just to meet all of those requirements that they would have to meet for a manufactured home. Any questions about RVs? And Sean O'Callahan can answer those better than I can. I'm not going to talk much about Zone A99 areas. They're weird, and I've never worked with them. I don't think have many in Montana, but it's for a federal flood protection system that is under construction, and they have certain legal requirements for the milestones that have to be met. They're pretty rare, and if you have one on your maps, then let's address that case by case. But I'm gonna keep moving. Okay, and our next one, so we've talked, and this graphic has the nice stair step image there. So we're cumulatively building on all of these requirements. But the next one that we're going to add into the mix is a floodway delineation. So we have maps that identify special flood hazard area for us. We've also got base flood elevations computed, and at least in riverine flooding, the most information that we can have available is to add in that floodway. And as this says, floodway regulations protect the property owner who may want to develop that land and adjacent folks as well. I think you guys have already had the mapping unit, and so you maybe recall that a floodway is not, you can't walk out to the river and say, oh, there's the floodway. It's not a physical feature. It's a sort of an engineering feature where you take this hydraulic model and basically squeeze the river until you hit certain thresholds, and that's how you delineate the floodway, is that area that can convey the full 1% flow within certain parameters. And the floodway is the area that has the highest velocities, the deepest depths, and is the most dangerous portion of the river or stream, which is why we are going to hold any development to a higher standard in the floodway. Yeah, we've talked about these. And here you can kind of see here that we've got the gray is the 1% special flood hazard area, and then the hatched area in between is the floodway. And so the floodway also, I will say, sort of simplifies your permitting process in this, what we call the fringe, in just the gray unhatched area, because we've already done this hydraulic squeezing in our model. So that hatched area can convey the full 1% flow in this. And what that means for any development in the fringe is that they do not have to perform an encroachment analysis. You might hear folks talk encroachment and no rise. So there is no need for an encroachment analysis in the fringe if you've got a floodway delineated. The applicant still has to design everything properly and have it be able to withstand that 1% event. So in the floodway, 60.3D prohibits fill, new construction, substantial improvements, and other development unless you can show that those proposed activities would result in no rise, in 0.00 feet of rise to that base flood elevation within the floodway. And we sort of sacrificed the fringe at that point, I suppose. Yep. Yeah, same message here. We prohibit any encroachment within that floodway unless they can demonstrate through hydrologic and hydraulic modeling that is not going to cause any rise. And you can sort of see that cross-sectional diagram of what it might look like. Any project in the floodway is going to be held to higher scrutiny. I mentioned those higher velocities, deeper depths. So an application has to have technical data. It's got to be signed and stamped by a licensed professional engineer. And you as a community FPA should require them to submit. You can see an example here. No rise, no impact certification. There are a couple templates out there. I know some engineers have a format they like, but I think it's in the 480 maybe that there's a template no rise certification for them to sign and stamp. But that is them sort of putting their professional stamp on a project and saying it has been properly designed for this more dangerous area of the floodplain. That certification, as I said, demonstrates that it's the encroachment is compliant. Basically, they're going to have to show no rise. And if you increase the BFE, then we're looking at things like a CLOMAR and LOMAR process. So most folks will just try to avoid that. Some states prohibit any development within the floodway. And remember, it's a performance standard. So you can, generally speaking, you can still develop within the floodway. You just have to meet a pretty high performance standard. Does anyone know Montana has a higher standard for, well, a couple higher standards for floodway development? Anybody feeling brave? Anybody know those, one of them?
Nadine,
If you're,
she knows, but she won't answer.
yeah, Nadine, you don't get to answer. You know this. So Montana, I mentioned that 1 foot encroachment limit when Montana, that's the national standard when you squeeze your floodplain as you're developing this model. National standard is to squeeze it until you get 1 foot of rise for your floodway. Montana has a higher standard of 1/2 foot. It may be more pertinent to the non-engineers on the call is that we prohibit new residential structures in the floodway. That's a big one. Yeah, and I've said this dirty.
Unless you're in certain counties. I'm joking. Then you get lots of visits from Tracy and I when you allow that to happen, right? Right, Tracy?
Yep.
And I've mentioned this dirty, I guess it's a 5-letter word, but the CLOMAR process is the way if you're going to increase the BFE, if you have a project that for whatever reason it has to increase the BFE in the floodway, there's no other way to design it, then you would submit a CLOMAR to FEMA. Again, it's not an official map change. It is saying this is the project we want to do. Here's what it would look like. FEMA reviews it and says, you know, maybe they say, yep, that looks good. It's going to increase BFEs in the floodway 0.3 feet. Here are all of these other considerations they look at. Then the community can permit that with a CLOMAR. But as this says, CLOMAR does not officially change those regulatory maps. The community has to require the applicant to submit a LOMAR, which is basically as-built upon completion of the project. So that's how we deal with rises in the BFE in the floodway, or in the just a zone AE without floodway if we're going to increase the BFE above 1 foot nationally, 1/2 foot in Montana.
Excuse me, Brent.
Yeah.
Would that increase your insurance rates though, if it's above the BFE, or increases if the BFE's increased, or the you know, anything's increased, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about insurance rates as an engineer, so I might punt that one. But one of the things that you're going to look at as part of the CLOMAR-LOMAR process is, are you bringing any existing structures into the floodplain that weren't there before? Are you, raising the BFE to a point where you're going to adversely impact an existing structure? Is certainly something that it will be looked at there. Tracy or Shaylee, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on insurance implications.
Yeah, it could definitely. We used to have a better handle on how much it would fluctuate, but under risk rating 2.0, they do look at actuarial risk. And so I would assume, based on that, if there's any sort of increase, it's going to create some sort of jump in the premium as well.
Yeah, it seemed like to me there was something in there about that, and I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, there's very actually strict language that says that if there is, like, if you're going to do a variance, and there's any type of increase, that you have to notify property owners that there could be an increase in insurance premiums. And I think they put a number, but I think that's kind of obsolete. I think it could be a lot higher now, Gary. It just is changing based on the legacy program no longer being around, and it being more actuarial rated program.
Thank you.
I have a quick question too. You start the project with the CLOMAR. So after the project, I'm sorry. After you submit, after the project is done, you submit the letter of map revision.
Yes.
How does that change? How does that change the map, the permitting process after that, or?
Yeah, I think I can answer what you're. I think I know what you're asking to answer.
Sorry, I should have asked it better.
No worries. It's a good question, and it's apart from whether you're taking the CFM or not, it's a really important question for the floodplain administrators on this call to be aware of. So I would say the order of operations, if there's a project that is going to increase the BFE at all in the floodway, the applicant has to obtain a CLOMAR upfront, and that conditional letter is the conditional part of that is saying this is what would happen if this project is done. At that point, once the applicant has a FEMA approved CLOMAR, and the reason that people don't necessarily like the CLOMAR process is there are fees. It's pretty expensive, even in terms of the amount of engineering that's required to get through it, and it takes time. But so applicant goes through that CLOMAR process, they get a FEMA approved CLOMAR. At that point, the community can permit the project and you can issue a floodplain development permit to them. But that permit has got to have as a condition that they submit a LOMAR. A LOMAR has to be submitted within 6 months of project completion, and that LOMAR is basically them saying, you know, yep, here's what we proposed to do in the CLOMAR. We got our permit. Now we've gone out and done it. We built it the same way that we said we are going to. So any increases in BFE or whatever is the same as what was already approved. And then that LOMAR is the process that will actually update the maps that you see. And why it's so important that the floodplain permit be conditioned on the applicant doing a LOMAR is because if you don't, as a community, if you don't condition it that way, and the developer goes bust, or they just kind of give you the middle finger and say, well, we're not going to do a LOMAR, it's expensive, the community's on the hook to make sure that that LOMAR gets done. So it has got to be a condition in that permit. But then, yeah, as you were saying, Ronnie, the LOMAR is the as-built, what is submitted afterward that formally updates those maps. And it's possible, even though it's quite an expense, somebody could go through the CLOMAR process and, plans change, or the money runs out for a developer, or they don't like what the results of that CLOMAR are, and so they may not go forward with it, which is why, yeah, that conditional part of it doesn't immediately update the maps. That's just the sort of what if at the beginning stage.
And Brent, maybe you can't comment on this. Maybe it's a Tracy question, but it's still a little bit fuzzy gray to me. Like sometimes when these guys, there's a CLOMAR involved and a CLOMAR needs requested, but at what stage do they get to issue the floodplain permit? Like, because hasn't there been a few examples where we tell them to hold on issuing the permit until they get the CLOMAR information back? Do you?
Yeah, I would say, I can't think of a recent example, but I would say kind of the company line is the applicant should have an issued CLOMAR before the floodplain permit is approved.
Okay, because the example I'm thinking of is in Beaverhead County.
Yeah, it would be before the community. It would not be a complete application until that CLOMAR decision document has been received.
Yeah.
So we just want our folks to be careful about giving that permit right away and just putting in the permit, get a CLOMAR. You want to see the CLOMAR or have them go through that possibly 6-month process before.
Yeah, if you have an applicant who's coming to you and saying, I'm increasing the BFE by 0.2 of a foot in the floodway, but it's okay, or I'm increasing it by a foot in the fringe or whatever, if you're not very comfortable with this process, please reach out to Tracy and Shilea or your regional engineer, and we can kind of talk through all of these considerations with you, because it is complicated.
I just wanted them, you know how I am, I'm an applied learner, so you can talk all these things, CLOMAR, LOMAR, whatever, but unless you know the practical application of how you're going to use it, that's what helps me understand the purpose. So hopefully it helps others. Okay, I'll shut up.
So I just have one other thing I'd like to add. From what I understand, the only reason you would submit a CLOMAR is if you were actually in an area where you want to build and you believe that it's going to increase the BFE, but you also the engineer believes that FEMA is going to approve it, because that's the only. You have to have that in order to invest all that money and start building. You better have that CLOMAR approved before you ever start that build, because if they come back and say, negative, we're not going to allow any increase whatsoever in the floodway, then, you know, you save yourself a lot of money. And that's what I understand the CLOMAR is for, is to prevent these folks from investing a lot of money into something, just to have it turn around FEMA say, nope, sorry, we won't allow you to do that.
Yeah, our former state floodplain engineer and bureau chief had a really good presentation that he would give on, it was on encroachment analyses, but he talked about how the CLOMAR process, or even just doing an encroachment analysis, is iterative. So they're sort of making those decisions and you know, maybe starting on the model. They say, here's the data that we have, and you're trying to decide how far in the process to go for approval before, you've got decision points, I suppose, is what I want to say. Yeah, but it can very much be an iterative design process where you're looking at multiple different options with the applicant and the engineer and the community and DNRC weighing in on technical aspects of it too. So yeah, it's not always just a straight line. Great discussion. I love this. Any other LOMAR thoughts? Okay, keep moving. There are pretty relatively few exceptions to this, but one exception to that no rise and encroachment CLOMAR mumbo jumbo that we've been talking about is what's called the conveyance shadow. So if we are here, you can sort of see these boundaries. We've got just the 1% floodplain here, and then our floodway here. We have an existing house in the floodway, and what's called the conveyance shadow provides a limited exception to build either upstream or downstream and not have to do that no rise certification. So if you're going to build within that conveyance shadow, you do not need to go through that pretty involved process of obtaining the effective model and stepping through that engineering analysis. If you're taking the CFM, I can guarantee you'll get a question on this, and you want to know that the upstream ratio is 1-to-1, and that downstream ratio is 4-to-1. And if you're a fisherman or you just like to wade in rivers, I mean, that sort of intuitively makes sense, right? As you're standing in the water, you can look down at your own legs and see maybe a mini version of this where you've got a little bit of run up on the upstream side, but then you've got that longer conveyance shadow downstream. And so that's the idea with a conveyance shadow, where within that area, no need to do that no rise certification. And this does come up. It's common for, like, somebody wants to put a little shed or something like that in there, and you will get a question on the CFM for sure. That's the last floodway slide that I have. Any questions generally about floodways before we move to the next section? Super. We'll keep going. So now we're going to talk about coastal high hazard areas. And I don't profess to be an expert in coastal high hazard areas. Montana does have areas that behave like coastal high hazard areas. Flathead Lake is a great example, and maybe in a slightly different universe would have actually been mapped as coastal high hazard. But to my knowledge, Montana does not have any regulated coastal high hazard areas. We do have areas that behave like them. Utah, Great Salt Lake, there are areas that act like this, even though they're inland. But generally, these are sort of the classic Florida, Louisiana photos that you see on the news. And these coastal high hazard areas, as we'll talk about in subsequent slides, have high velocities, high wind, and all sorts of things that make them even harder to administer. And again, oh yeah.
Hey, Brent, I was just sorry I interrupted you.
Please.
Bad timing. I just wanted to let you know that we do have 2 of our Utah friends on today, so that next section will be of relevance to them. So I just wanted to let you know that.
And am I right that Utah actually has regulatory coastal high hazard areas, or is in the process of that?
Yeah, this is Mackenzie. So I'm the state floodplain planner, or NFIP planner for Utah. But yeah, we have the Great Salt Lake is currently being mapped right now. It's just taking a lot of time. We were talking with our risk map coordinator the other day, and she was saying that, yeah, they're using like 100 years of historical data and then a whole bunch of other things to get everything done. So it's taking some time. And then Utah Lake will also be our other one. So, and Utah Lake, most of that one is done. They're still working on finalizing everything, but we're getting pretty close to prelims and everything. So
cool. Yeah. So this will be very applicable there then. And I think Flathead Lake in Montana is a great great example of somewhere that may behave like the Great Salt Lake, but is not currently regulated as coastal high hazard. So super. Yeah, I remember years ago when I was just a student in Floodplain Bootcamp, we had, I think it was South Carolina, give us some extra considerations one day on these coastal high hazard areas, and even just the modeling behind them is so different than the riverine flooding that I'm used to. Yeah, it's a different world. But just I guess before I move on, I want to just keep hammering this stair step point here that subsection E is the portion dealing with coastal high hazard areas. And remember, we're building on that stair step, so we've still got to address all of the previous requirements. And coastal high hazard areas, yeah, may or may not have floodways that we just talked about. So same concept, just a coastal flooding source instead of a riverine flooding source like most of us in the Intermountain West are used to. These zone VE and numbered V zones. So remember, if it's got E after it, like a zone VE or zone AE, that means that it's got an elevation determined. And when I look at these coastal high hazard elevations of 9 and 12, I always think that they're missing 2 or 3 numbers. I'm used to Montana elevations. So when we delineate these coastal high hazard areas, it's areas with velocity hazards or areas with wave action that is 3 foot or greater, and we've got the BFE determined that you can see here. Here's what we're going to try to get through and talk about these different requirements for coastal high hazard areas. Lowest horizontal member, new construction. We're going to talk about breakaway walls, fill, and these dunes and mangroves, and then we'll touch on manufactured homes and RVs. So remember, when we are elevating in an A zone for the BFE, we're going to measure the structure at the top of the lowest floor. That the top of the lowest floor has to be at or above the BFE. And remember, that's the national standard. So I want to talk about national standards for everybody if you're taking the CFM, but I also want to try to point out Montana's higher standards that you're actually going to have to use in your day job. So remember, A-zone at or above BFE. Montana has 2 foot of freeboard is the requirement. And then even nationally, when a building is rated for insurance purposes, they subtract 1 foot from that elevation. So even if you're not in a state like Montana that has a higher standard, you should really encourage the applicant to go up at least 1 foot above the BFE, or they're going to have higher insurance premiums. But don't ask me about risk rating 2.0. So back to what we're talking about, coastal high hazard zones. These zones, because they're more dangerous areas, have these higher velocities, winds from hurricanes, wave actions, we are instead going to be a little more conservative, and we're going to measure to the bottom of that lowest horizontal structural member. The bottom of that member has to be at or above the BFE, with the idea there that as waves are breaking and we have all that force on that lowest structural member, we want it to at least be at or above the BFE. We're going to talk about open foundations and all of that in a subsequent slide, but notice this pretty much squares with what I see in Montana. We elevate on fill. We bring in a bunch of dirt, but these coastal high hazard areas, we're going to talk about posts and piers and all sorts of other fancy things. One of the additional requirements in a coastal high hazard area is you've got to be, this is a goofy phrase for a landlubber like me, but you've got to be landward of the mean high tide, which I interpret to mean all those Instagram things you see in Bali where they're buildings way out over the ocean. That is not NFIP compliant. You can't build way out over the ocean, as lovely as that might look in your vacation photos. We've got to have all of our new construction on the landward side of the mean high tide. And this photo is a good example. Good example of being
surprised.
out.
Sorry, Brent. I was just surprised though. If you think about the piers, I mean, the piers are all built out over there, and it just makes me wonder how they get away with doing that.
Yeah, so this is going to be for new construction or substantial improvement, substantial damage of an existing structure. If it's been if it was constructed way back when, before the community got floodplain maps and before they began participating in the NFIP, then they're essentially grandfathered in until they go to substantially improve or to rebuild after it's substantially damaged. But totally, I have lived in the Intermountain West my entire life, so I'm not an expert in this, but you do see, I don't know if I want to say non-compliant, but structures that are way out on piers over the ocean. And the idea, you guys, I can't remember when you're talking about substantial improvement, substantial damage. The idea is not to, with NFIP, to immediately get everything perfectly compliant. It's recognizing that all of this costs a huge amount of money, and to bring people into compliance as we can, as maybe they suffer damage or they really want to upgrade their house. It's a long game, I suppose.
So eventually all the piers will disappear, apparently. Eventually,
every structure in Montana will be in the floodplain will be 2 feet above BFE, and everything. We'll have no more flood damage eventually. So this is a huge one. All new construction and substantial improvements have to be elevated on pilings and columns so that we can resist those wind and water loads. And it makes sense even if you're a landlubber like me, if you've been to the beach, right? Sorry, we're going to talk about this on another slide, I think. No, maybe I'm talking about it here, but we want to do pilings and columns, and you can see it didn't work out for this structure, but so that we can allow waves and wind and everything to pass through that foundation. If we put fill in, there are slides of this later, but if we had fill in here, it's just going to get hammered and get destroyed. But our new construction and substantially improved construction has got to be the foundation for those piers, has to be able to resist those stronger wind and water loads. And we'll talk about this in another slide too, but that is sort of a theme here is going to involve the services of a design professional, an engineer or an architect. Structural engineers can talk about load paths until they're blue in the face, but the general idea, if you're in Montana or Utah, you think about it's the same thing for snow loads, right? If you've got a whole bunch of snow on your roof, you want to have a clear path that transfers the weight, both of your house and the snow, down the support columns and into the foundation. So it's the same thing if you're building in a coastal high hazard area. These load paths, you've got to have a continuous path that is reinforced, and it will help also prevent lateral movement and collapse. And if you want to be bored to tears, just talk to a structural engineer about load paths and influence diagrams. Here's an example on the left of one that was non-compliant, had those screws ripped out and failed. And on the right here is a proper connection system that is going to transfer loads and withstand all of those additional lateral forces. Another requirement in coastal high hazard areas, we've got to have the area below that lowest floor. Remember, and I'm trying to tie back things we've previously talked about. Parking access and storage are those only allowable uses. Parking access and storage. But that area below the lowest floor has got to be free of obstruction. And if you're going to enclose it, use things like breakaway walls, excuse me, open wood lattice or insect screening, stuff like that. But you want non-supporting breakaway walls that, as you can see in this example, will do exactly as the name implies during a storm event. They will break away, but they will leave those columns or piers in place and supporting the structure. And remember all those considerations with a non-conversion agreement and all of that we talked about in a previous week. Here's an example of a breakaway wall that failed. It's maybe a little tough to see, but you can see here they have attached utilities straight to the breakaway wall. And obviously, if you're attaching things to a breakaway wall, it's not going to break away like it's designed to during a flood event. I think we've got another similar example with a utility, with a water line here that's installed right behind that supporting post, and another one on the right where they've connected it to the breakaway wall, and you can see during the flood that breakaway wall didn't break away, and so the potential there is that you build up lots of debris or even just the forces of the wind and waves, and it can fail your supports and cause destruction of the house. Whereas if the breakaway wall gets out of the way like it's supposed to, it will allow for freer movement of the wind and wave forces. Similar maybe thoughts with building fences, like a big privacy fence in the floodplain, in a riverine flooding in Montana. Similar concept, I suppose. Lattice work is a great option. You know, provides a little bit of privacy for folks, but it will still let water and wind pass through. And if there's considerable pressure, it'll just collapse. So we can see one of those allowable uses: parking, parking access and storage here. That's great. And remember that if they've got something like lattice or insect screening or something that's partially open, it's a lot less tempting for them to convert it to a habitable area that would be out of compliance. And it's easier to confirm for you as the floodplain administrator that they have not done that for something that's open. Bracing, cross bracing can be an important design element because it'll help increase the stiffness, and it makes sense if you played with blocks as a kid, right? Those lateral forces, if you can tie them together, it may be part of your engineer or architect's design to help withstand those lateral forces. The danger, obviously, that you can see in this photo is that it's going to trap debris, and if you get a bunch of debris against that, can cause failure there during a flood event or a hurricane. So using the minimum that is necessary to meet those requirements for lateral forces, and if you put the braces near the top, can help avoid some problems with debris. And that's something that the designer for the applicant, they should provide those details to you. Here's another thing that they ought to provide, a V-zone certificate. This, if we're a structure in zone V, we've got to have either an engineer or an architect certify the design and the methods of construction. And they're, again, sort of like an encroachment analysis, they're putting their professional stamp and liability on this, saying that it is being properly designed to withstand those additional forces for winds and waves that we expect in coastal high hazard areas. So you as the community need to require a copy of this, and then keep a copy of that certificate in the permit file as well. I jumped the gun a little bit on this as well, but we're in coastal high hazard areas, we are not going to use fill. You can see why in these examples where they were placed on fill, and obviously fill does not allow wind or waves to move through it, so it is just going to get hammered by those forces and either fail, or you can see the building sort of cracked and started to slide off. We're going to use this, as we've talked about, those piers, posts, columns, all of that stuff, with or without breakaway walls that will allow for winds and waves to move through that foundation area. One more requirement here is to basically leave sand dunes and mangrove stands intact. Those provide, in addition to really important ecosystem services, those provide a lot of flood protection, natural flood protection, right? Sand dunes and mangroves slow the waves down and reduce flood damage. So in these coastal high hazard areas, that is one requirement, is that those are not altered. Manufactured homes have to meet those requirements listed out there. However, there is that same exception if you're in an existing manufactured home park. There's that same national exception that I think one or 2 weeks ago, Tracy gave some good background on sort of the political pressure to allow that to where they can go up just 3 feet above grade rather than actually at or above the BFE. But you can see here, it looks like they're these ones at least are elevated on columns rather than fill, so they would allow wind and wave action below them. The one thing I do want to say too, and this should be addressed in that V-zone certification, the engineer or architect should look at is scour. So if you're think about bridges in Montana or columns on the coast, but they should look at scour and ensure that those support columns are placed deep enough that they're not going to scour out during that regulatory 1% event and cause failure. That's an important piece. RVs, it's those same requirements that we just talked about earlier today for coastal high hazard areas, 180 days or fewer, and or they've got to basically be ready to roll, licensed and ready for highway use. Okay, I think I've blown through, yeah. Any questions on coastal high hazard areas before we wrap up for the day? I've got a few more slides.
Brent, there was one other thing I was thinking about on that, the trailers that you didn't mention is, don't they have to be anchored as well? The mobile homes?
Yeah, these manufactured homes, yeah. Yep. They sorry, I didn't go through these requirements, but yeah, they would have to meet those same requirements that we talked about earlier, where they've got to be anchored, you know, or I think a couple weeks ago we had that photo of the tie down that goes over the top and attaches them. Yeah, so they've got to meet those same requirements that we already talked about.
Thank you.
I've got just a couple of quick things to try to wrap up. We've talked already about some higher standards and I've tried to give some examples of Montana's higher standards. Remember that 44 CFR 60.3 is just minimum standards required for participation. Entire states or individual NFIP communities can add higher standards and are encouraged to. Benefits, right, where higher standards reduce flood damage, make that development safer, improve resilience, all of these good things. They sort of the carrot in this approach is that they can reduce the cost of flood insurance premiums through that community CRS community rating system. One example, compensatory storage, sort of a cut fill question here. If you're gonna add fill, take up some storage, well, you can excavate it here so that you're compensating for the fill. Mentioned this one as well, but Montana has a lower floodway surcharge than the national limit. So when we are when we're squeezing that floodplain model to come up with our floodway, Montana, we squeeze it until we get half a foot of rise. Nationally is 1 foot, and so that is a higher standard here in Montana. Oh boy, and LIMWA. I again do not profess to be an expert here, but it is the limit of moderate wave action. It's another, as you can see, coastal high hazard thing. I think that it's the idea behind this is that, you know, FEMA observed that even with all of the coastal high hazard mapping, there can still be quite a bit of flood damage at wave heights between 1.5 and 3 feet. And so this LIMWA line is an informational line that is sometimes provided on these maps. And you can, if you can see here, it's just in that upper left corner. Yeah, black line, and it shows where those wave heights are between 1.5 and 3 feet. And marks the limit, I believe, of that, the inland limit of the coastal A zone. Okay, we have just a minute or two left. So, no, sorry, we're over time. So yeah, common higher standards. Don't store materials in the floodplain, setbacks, all of these things. We talked briefly about cumulative substantial improvement. If you have higher standard, if you have questions or want to talk more about higher standards, Tracy, Shelley, your regional engineer, anybody would be happy to talk about that with you. And I'm not going to say much about international building codes other than they can be applicable to floodplain management, and they can what do I want to say? They have higher standards. And if you want to learn more, yeah, you can look at the slide after the fact. But I am over time, so with that, I will stop. And if there are any questions, happy to answer them now.
Hey, thanks, Brent. I really appreciate you. This is your last time to have an expert engineer, you know, teach you. You're going to be stuck with the non-engineering mind going forward, just a warning. So use it while you can.
Thanks, Brent. Appreciate it.